There's 2, 20, 40, 60.
It's no longer pennies that count, but 20s. Michelle Saunders and her partner Andy Frost can't afford the supermarkets anymore, so they use this discounted shop run by their local food bank.
Are there days when you're having to skip meals?
Yeah, there was, 2 days ago, I had, I think it was 4 sandwiches. Michelle sat there and she didn't eat anything. All she had was a milkshake in a little bottle thing.
You're feeling quite depressed about it?
Yeah, I do get depressed sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's just all the food's getting expensive and that. And it's worrying me and everything. And that.
It's worrying.
It is, it's stressing me because
I've seen it. I've
just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and it's worrying me and everything. It's making me depressed.
I woke up one morning, well, several mornings, and Michelle, my partner, has actually been in tears because we've had hardly anything in the cupboard or fridge.
That's why I have to keep phoning these up.
Oh, I'm sorry. It must be such a worry for you. I'm
It
really
is.
sorry.
Last year at the food bank, they were making 50 to 100 parcels a week. Now it's as many as 300. Demand is up, but donations are down. Inflation, the rate at which prices rise, is officially at 9%, but for many it feels much higher.
So people who used to donate to food banks just can't afford to anymore?
People don't have the extra income anymore. All that is tightening up. The hike in gas and electric is enough to, it's almost a small mortgage.
They also rely on supermarket surpluses, but what they receive in those surpluses has changed recently, in a telling sign of just how many are feeling the crisis.
Vegan mayo, things like quinoa, we'll have sometimes pickled items.
Why are you getting these random sort of high-end foods in it? Is this what isn't selling in the supermarkets?
I can imagine they're not selling at the volume that other things are.
At the local corner shop, customers are spending less. We haven't seen prices rising as fast as this in 4 decades. And high inflation isn't being matched by high income growth. Wages aren't keeping up.
It's not just the level of inflation that's worrying, but the staggering speed at which it's risen. Just last year, there were warnings that inflation was too low at below 1%. Remember that the Bank of England's target is 2%. It's now shot up to nearly 10%. And it's the poorest who will be hit hardest.
Some analysts warn we're seeing all the ingredients for a recession, although officially inflation is at 9%. When you break it down by income group, inflation for the poorest tenth of the population has actually risen to nearly 11%. For the richest tenth, it's just 8%. That's because the poorest spend 11% of their household budget on ever more expensive electricity and gas. The richest, just 4%. Charities say the government needs to offer households more support. 3/4 of the inflation rise has come from energy bills. And Labour has again called for a windfall tax on energy profits in a rowdy PMQs.
Just doesn't get it, does he? He doesn't actually understand what working families are going through in this country, struggling about how they're going to pay their bills.
Well, let me tell you what we're already doing. We're already spending £22 billion. We're already helping people with the cost of living in any way that we can, Mr. Speaker.
The government says it's ready to take further action if needed. For Andy Holhouse, that action is needed now. He set up his own business after leaving the army, but after an accident is now on benefits.
You're hard pressed. You've got to make hard choices. It's like the gas was turned off because we can't afford to use the central heating. So you live in a house where you boil a kettle to make hot water for a drink, but also to wash the pots. Do I pay a full bill or do I pay a part now and just keep paying it off in small amounts? I mean, and there's certain bills you can't avoid paying, so by the time you finish paying them, there's what you want and what you need.
Having to choose between what we want and what we need is only likely to get harder, with the Chancellor admitting tonight that the next few months will be tough. Darshana Soni, Channel 4 News, Nottingham.
Well, the question of whether to impose a windfall tax on energy companies was the main topic of Prime Minister's questions. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, said the government should stop dithering and introduce the tax. Boris Johnson said the government was already helping people, but claimed he didn't want to raise taxes. So is the government planning more help with rising costs? Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster. Gary.
I think it's fair to say that the government's engagement with the idea of a windfall tax on the oil and gas companies has been on a bit of a journey. It started with a blanket no, wouldn't touch anything like that. It then moved to another phase where I think it's fair to say the answers were performative. And this was talked about inside Whitehall. We will look as though we're engaging with it, but of course we wouldn't touch it with a barge pole, but you don't want to look like you've dismissed it. Now we seem in a new phase where the government is genuinely having a look at this. Frit perhaps because of the way Labour has been piling on the pressure on the issue, the way it's been looking in their own polling, and a little bit of pressure from some on their own backbenches who've noticed that this, every now and again, this is a government that says it's not going to do something. They pile in the lobbies and vote a certain way, only to discover that the government flips around and does it. So there's quite a lot of anxiety amongst Tory MPs. They don't want to be exposed on that, and you saw that a bit in the vote last night, where some of them didn't exactly toe the line. What are we going to get more immediately? Well, it does appear that before the recess we're going to get some emergency measures which the government will bring in to help people with the cost of living, and in that I think we are going to see movement on the warm homes discount, substantial movement there, maybe some other targeted measures. And I think the government also, there's a feeling I've picked up, is hoping that when it announces public sector pay awards, that might contribute to a bit of goodwill as well, a feeling amongst people that the government is doing the right thing, even if it's not managing to cover all their costs. But the sort of numbers you hear talked about in the public sector pay rounds, 4 to 5%, are of course appreciably lower the inflation rate. And it's quite possible that although people in Whitehall think, well, I think people feel this is quite an advance after years of sort of relatively frozen pay, it's quite possible that people actually feel aggrieved about those numbers when they do the sums. There's also, of course, a budget coming up at the end of the year. It looks as though the Chancellor's going to save any tax-cutting measures for then. Meanwhile, as you're hearing in Darshna's report, he's warning of tough times and how the government isn't going to be able to help you all the way to covering your increased costs. And ain't that the truth?
Thanks, Gary. Well, we've been speaking to the Department for Work and Pensions Minister, Chloe Smith, about the mounting pressures on people's finances and the disproportionate impact of inflation on more vulnerable people. Today, the Minister for Disabled People visited a jobs fair which links people with disabilities to potential employers. Our social affairs editor, Jackie Long, has this.
In a world with record numbers of job vacancies, for people with a disability, too many still face an unequal struggle to find work. Adam has a learning disability and a burning desire to share what he's discovered about finding a job with anyone who will listen.
I believe that when you start a job, that job goes with you forever.
Today, it's the Minister for Disabled People, Chloe Smith. She was on a visit to a disability job fair at the Job Centre in Hackney to try and make the world of work a fairer place for disabled people. A stroke ended Sibonisiwe Sibanda's career as a nurse. She's looking for anything now.
Tell me how important it is for you to get back to work.
Because I came here because of nursing. I didn't come here to sit. Please, I wanted a job.
New government figures have seen 1 million more disabled people in work than 5 years ago. But that good news tempered by a cost of living crisis, which is hitting the disabled particularly hard. Research shows disabled people face extra costs of around £600 a month. And as inflation rises to 9%, the pressure is clearly building. I spoke to the minister outside.
We've had a really important milestone achieved this week of seeing 1.3 million more disabled people in work than only 5 years ago. And in fact, that's a government manifesto commitment reached in half the time than we'd expected it to be. So there's much more to do. And what we're doing today is looking to match up local disabled job seekers with employers who are here with open arms.
The employability gap is still too big, isn't it?
Well, that's right. And so I care very much about that disability employment gap. We have record vacancies and very, very high levels of employment. Those are all really good things. What I want to make sure of is that disabled people are part of that economic growth.
What about people with disabilities who simply cannot work, but their income can't rise? So what are they supposed to do?
We understand that there's a lot of pressures at the moment, and that's why we're acting with further help on the cost of living. £22 billion this year, including things like the Household Support Fund and other things on energy bills, which are there to help people. It's just not enough, though, is it? Which is there to help people in the most vulnerable households.
It's just not enough. You have to acknowledge that, surely.
I think we are seeing a situation where you've got big action there from the government, £22 billion. I think you could ask any one of your viewers to take a look at the Household Support Fund. I think we also want to be encouraging people to make use of the support that's available through benefits.
A raft of charities and campaign groups say that the thing the government must do right now to help people with disabilities and others on low income is to increase benefits. Inflation today is 9%, benefits have gone up by 3%. People are existing at a deficit every month. Why not increase benefits?
And this is why the government is acting. This is why we've acted to support the cost of living with that £22 billion that I've been talking to you about.
Why are you not? Why is the government not moving to increase benefits? There is
Indeed, we have. They went up in April
3%,
by inflation.
Is 9%.
And as you will know very, very well, governments of all colours over all the years have increased benefits by what's usually the September CPI. We have followed exactly that model.
Scope, Leonard Cheshire, Mind, the MS Society, Child Poverty Action Group. I could go through a raft of others who say that is what needs to be done, that benefits must rise.
I understand these pressures and I understand the argument, and indeed I have discussed them myself with those charities that you mentioned and with many other disabled peoples besides. I'm listening very hard to those arguments. The government has acted with the Household Support Fund, with other measures as well. In addition to that, what we are here today to do is to help people take those steps into work that for many they will have been shut out of for too long. That is a deep injustice in our society and that I'm passionate about fixing.
I mean, 1 in 6 working households are in poverty. So work is not always the route out of poverty.
There we are with the action we've taken again to improve universal credit and the taper rate.
The government took more than £1,000 a year from people on some of the lowest incomes when it cut the uplift to universal credit. Do you regret doing that now? Was that the wrong thing to do?
We'd always been clear that that uplift was designed at the time of the pandemic.
But given where we are now,
designed at the time of the pandemic, designed at the time of the pandemic,
struggling to heat their homes.
You're just interrupting me now, but we took that action at the crunch time during the pandemic to be able to give help where it was most needed. We were always clear that it was temporary. And indeed, we have then taken these other steps as time has moved on to be able to put support where it is most needed.
Chloe Smith, thank you very much for talking to us today. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, as Gary reported, Labour have been putting the pressure on the government today over the question of an emergency budget, in particular wanting a windfall tax, which would tax the energy producers and distribute money to people to help pay their bills. Joining us now is Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Minister for Levelling Up, who's in Central Lobby. Lisa Nandy, thank you for joining us. We've talked about the windfall tax and how that might help people many times. So let's talk about what else you think Labour should do, or the government should do, to help people. What would be in an emergency budget?
Well, we think it's a mistake to raise national insurance at a time when people are really struggling. That's one of the measures that we're calling on the government to axe. We're the only country in the developed world that is raising taxes on working people in the middle of record inflation and still coming out of a pandemic. So we think that's one thing that the government ought to do right now. We're also calling on them to bring forward measures to retrofit homes. Home insulation has really fallen off a cliff under this Conservative government. And if we really started to kickstart that programme again, not only could we cut people's energy bills and get money back into people's pockets, but it'd be a great boost to local economies as well.
Right, but insulation's quite a long-term project to get done to the point where it actually has an impact on people's bills. So in the short term, you are saying that high inflation does mean pain for the British population. There's no getting away from it.
Well, look, people are in pain right now. There's no getting away from that. This is the worst time that I can really remember. You've got lots of people still reeling from the impact of the pandemic. You've got huge record levels of inflation. Prices are going up, but wages have stagnated for nearly a decade. And people just simply don't know how they're going to keep their heads above water. Yeah. It's having a knock-on impact on businesses. We've got to do something now to get money back into people's pockets. And that's why we're pushing the government to bring in an emergency budget. It just genuinely astonishes me that you've got ministers who are absolutely tone deaf, who are standing just a few yards away from me now in the chamber trying to defend inaction in the face of what is a crisis for most people.
But you've only come up with two tax measures on an emergency budget. I'm not sure you need an emergency budget just for that, do you? I mean, the question is it government's job to bring down inflation? Or is it just to try and alleviate the effects of inflation for the poorest people?
Look, we say the answer to this is to get growth back into the economy. We've got high taxes because we've got low growth. And if you start to get the economy moving again, then people earn, they spend. Money in people's pockets mean that they're spending it on local high streets. The government's levelling up agenda has just disappeared. But it's more important now than ever that they deliver it, because this is how we get the economy moving again and get people through this painful crisis period. That's why we've been saying to them, invest in things like home insulation, but also take a longer term approach. We said last year at Labour Party conference that we would invest 28 billion a year every year in climate investment. That means good jobs back into coastal and industrial communities where we've seen them depart for far too long. The answer to this is growth.
Well, you're saying the answer to this is government spending. And the problem is that isn't government spending also inflationary?
No, look, there's a couple of measures that the SNP and the Lib Dems are proposing tonight that we're not supporting. And the reason that we're not supporting them is because we are careful with people's money. It's their money and they haven't got a lot of it. But if you cut VAT on energy bills, then you do something to help with inflation, but you also get money to those who most need it. Because VAT is a regressive measure in that it hits people who have less money harder.
But you're talking about stimulating the economy, aren't you? We're stimulating growth. That means government spending.
We're talking about investing. There's a big difference between spending and investing. The government currently is spending. They're throwing pots of money at different places, asking them to compete for them, to put a lick of paint on the high street and paper over the cracks of economies that are not growing. We've got to get our local economies growing again. There are two ways to do that. Short term, you get money back into people's pockets, so they go out and spend it on the high streets and in local businesses. But longer and medium term, you've got to start investing in bringing good jobs to Britain. There's a global race on for these clean energy technology jobs, and we need to invest to bring them here.
Do you think the Bank of England's done a good job in controlling inflation?
Well, look, I think that it's fair to say that there are global pressures that all countries are facing, but that Britain is having a particularly difficult time. One of the reasons that we're having a particularly difficult time, which is not the Bank of England's responsibility, is because we're still, years after the Prime Minister promised to get Brexit done, stuck with a paper-thin Brexit deal with threats to our trade arrangements with other countries.
I'm asking you about the bank. Specifically, do you? Because some people are criticising the bank. Obviously, Bank of England independence was a Labour policy after the 1997 win. Yeah. Do you have any criticisms of the Bank of England?
No, we support. It was our policy to give independence to the Bank of England, and that's something that we still support because it brings a more long-term approach and long-term outlook to the economy. But there are things that the government could be doing now, we could be doing now as a country. That's what we're calling on the government to do today, to get that Brexit arrangement sorted so that it doesn't impede our trade deals, to provide that long-term certainty for businesses, to get investment back into communities that need them, and to get money into people's pockets right now, which is what we're voting on this evening.
Lisa Nandy, thank you very much.
Thank you.